Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joseph Houston, and as the director of the Lewiston Public Library, I'd like to welcome you all to Great Falls Forum. The Forum is a monthly speaker series featuring leaders in the areas of business, public policy, academia, and the arts, and is a partnership of Bates College, the Sun Journal, and the Lewiston Public Library. This year marks the 28th season of Great Falls Forum. We thank you for your support and ensuring the program's continued success. Today's program is also streaming live via Zoom, and a recording will be available on the library's YouTube page. Please visit lplonline.org for more information. Please mark your calendars for the next Great Falls Forum on December 18th. At the conclusion of today's program, there will be an opportunity for audience questions. Those in the room are welcome to raise their hands, and those joining us virtually can enter their questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we will read these to our speaker. And now I have the pleasure of introducing today's featured speakers, Susan Roche, Michael Kebede, and moderator Mana Abdi. Susan Roche is the executive director of the Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project in Portland. She started as the organization's first staff attorney in 2000 and became executive director in 2013. Michael Kebede is the policy director of ACLU of Maine in Portland. He joined the ACLU of Maine in 2019 as policy counsel and became policy director in 2025. Mana Abdi is serving her second term in the Maine House of Representatives, representing District 95 in Lewiston. Please welcome Susan, Michael, and Mana to Lewiston.
Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, Mike? All right. Thank you for being here for this conversation. My name is Mana, as mentioned, and I have the privilege of serving as a state legislator for part of Lewiston in the as a House representative. I'm grateful to be moderating this discussion today. Before we talk about Maine specifically, I want to zoom out. Immigration is often framed as a border issue, but at its core is a test of our democracy. Who belongs, who gets protected, and whether due process is treated as a right for everyone or a privilege for a few. Across the country, we're seeing immigration enforcement move in a way that bypass the safeguards we value: transparency, accountability, and the basic right to be heard. And that national reality shapes what we're seeing here at home as well, in our courts, in our communities, and in the policy decisions sitting on the governor's desk right now. And today, we have two phenomenal human beings that have been introduced to help us make sense of this moment. Michael is the policy director at the ACLU of Maine, and he helped write the bill, currently awaiting the governor's decision. Sue is the executive director of the Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project, which it represents thousands of people across the state, including many who are directly targeted by ICE. Thank you both for being here today. To start big, when you look at immigration nationally right now, what does it reveal about the health of our democracy and our commitment to due process? Michael, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Representative Abdi. Thank you all for having me. Mayor Shaleen is here. Thank you, Mayor, and I want to mention my colleague Alicia Ray, who lives in Lewiston, is an incredible colleague to have. I see a representative over there as well. I don't want to embarrass you, but it's great to be here. Thank you all for having me. So the question you asked was, where are we nationally on immigration, and how does that relate to our constitutional right to be free from the deprivation of liberty or life without due process? As you all know, the Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution guarantees every person in the United States, not just every citizen, but every person, the right to due process before a deprivation of life, liberty, or property. If you have even a cursory familiarity with how federal immigration enforcement has been proceeding over the last year, you'll know that many people have been deprived of liberty without due process. And constitutional violations have been systematic and widespread. And so it's been incumbent on every public official who takes an oath to uphold the federal Constitution, and our state and other state constitutions have an analog to the Fifth Amendment. It's incumbent upon them to not take part in these widespread violations of the Constitution. And so that's partly why I worked on LD 1971 with Representative Rana. Happy to discuss it further. But the bottom line is we have a federal government that doesn't respect the Constitution. And all of our officials, elected officials, take an oath to uphold that document. What the ACLU does is help public officials uphold the Constitution. And when the government violates it, we sue the government as well. I'll stop there and see if you have any questions.
I'd love to hear your thought on that as well, Sue.
Yeah, thank you, Representative. So yeah, first I'll just explain a little bit about what ILAP does. We are Maine's only immigration legal aid organization based in Portland. We also have an office here in Lewiston and do some work through our Rural Maine project representing clients throughout the state. Primarily, we provide direct immigration legal services, so helping people gain legal status through primarily humanitarian forms of immigration relief like asylum, special visas for domestic violence and trafficking victims and unaccompanied minors. We also do a lot of, and we also have a detention project where we represent a lot of individuals in removal proceedings and more individuals who are detained. We also do some community education and outreach and some systemic advocacy in collaboration with ACLU of Maine and Maine Immigrants' Rights Coalitions and others. And so one of the things in immigration that sort of underlies a lot of this is just the complexity of the immigration law. And one of the reasons is there's enormous amount of discretion that's been given to the executive branch. So that means that when there's a new administration, although our entire immigration system is very flawed and had, through every administration has had a lot of issues, but because we have our laws that have to go through Congress and then regulations that need to be promulgated by the agencies, because of the discretion the executive branch gets, they are able to issue executive orders and agency memos that really talk about how the agency is going to implement the laws. Those still need to comply; they need to be within the regulations and the statutes. But that's what we've been seeing really since the beginning of the Trump administration, is that use of executive power really beyond the law. The goal of the administration has really been to try to deport as many immigrants from the United States as rapidly as possible, and particularly focusing on communities of color. And the way this has been done, one is through making it as hard as possible to have legal status. So this means issuing these executive orders and other policies that make it more difficult to even qualify for status that people really should qualify for, including asylum, taking away status like temporary protected status and parole, humanitarian parole that many people had that gave them work authorization, and then putting up barriers to pursuing legal status, which means limiting due process as much as possible, often outside the law. We've seen limiting access to attorneys, making it more difficult to defend yourself in immigration court, detaining as many people as possible. So this is, in the past, we saw mostly people who were detained were those who had criminal convictions or those who were security threats. Now it's really a wide range of anyone who doesn't have permanent status. And in some cases, they're even, because they're sort of swiping people up in these sort of racially profiled raids, even U.S. citizens and people with permanent status have been detained. I think up to 170 U.S. citizens last month anyway had been detained across the country. And so this means somebody who's entered the country, applied for asylum, they're following the law, they've never broken the law, they have family members here, they're working, they can get detained. And so we're seeing a lot of situations where people are being stopped by local law enforcement, turned over to ICE, and then they get into this machine. Also, there's really horrible conditions in a lot of the jails that immigrants are being held at. Sometimes there's not access to attorneys. We've had a difficult time sometimes getting into some of the jails. And then there's a policy of really trying to people are disappearing, basically, where somebody might come home from work and their husband just didn't come home from work that day. They have to do all this work to try to track them down. There's a lack of transparency with ICE not providing information about where people are, or because we're a border state, we have a lot of Border Patrol officers, and it's even more difficult to track people down when they're in Border Patrol custody in that interim when they're in the process of being turned over to ICE. And then they're being rapidly, in many cases, shipped out of state and moved to other states, and sometimes moved multiple times, which makes it very difficult for loved ones to get to them, and other resources and attorneys. We have clients who have been moved, and it's just very difficult to provide information or access to them. And then part of the due process violations includes taking away the right to have a court hearing. So expedited removal, which is something that has been in the law for a long time, but was typically just in the past was only applied to people who were within 100 yards of the border in the first 2 weeks in the United States, where they are not permitted to have a hearing in immigration court unless they express a fear of persecution and can apply for asylum. That's now being applied throughout the whole country. So people who can't prove that they've been here for 2 years can get picked up, detained, shipped across the country, and then deported without a hearing. And this is, again, being used beyond the law. We had a client who had a temporary protected status application that had been pending for more than 2 years, was clearly here for more than 2 years. We had to fight in immigration court to get the client bond, and I still didn't want to get him removed. So just the amount of effort that needs to go in to keep people out of detention. And there's also, especially when people are kept away from attorneys and loved ones, there's a lot of pressure for people to sign waivers of their right to a hearing so that people just get deported. We also have seen the extension of people getting deported to third countries, which is very, very problematic. And what this is doing is also creating a real climate of fear. So everybody is so afraid that they will self-deport. And that's another goal of the government. They don't have to do any work if people are just going to self-deport themselves. So this sort of all together is really one of the key things they also need is really to have local and state law enforcement cooperating with them. And this could be the formal agreements, the 287G agreements. We saw one that happened in Wells that got rescinded, which was wonderful, with a lot of community pushback. And then informal cooperation, which, as Michael was referring to, we're seeing a lot of local law enforcement turning people over to ICE. But I'll turn things back to you because that's getting more local.
No, thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'll stay with sort of you in how have you, because ILAP has been carrying cases around immigration for a long time now. How have you seen ICE tactic enforcement patterns shift in Maine over the past few years?
Yeah, thank you. So ILAP has been around for 30 years. We started out as a pro bono project, and then for the last 25 years, we've been a staffed organization. And we've always, represented individuals who were detained and people who were, where ICE was enforcing the law against them. And, there's always been issues. So lack of due process in many immigration proceedings, the lack of fairness has just existed beyond, through every administration. So that has always been an issue. What we've seen in this year is, as I was saying, like the focus, under the Obama administration and the Biden administration primarily was focused on people who had, unless you're at the border, where there was a lot of other stuff going on, but typically, at least here in Maine, mostly we're focused on people who had criminal records and people who are national security risks. If somebody had, even sort of just minor like traffic offenses was not something that would result in ICE enforcement. We also had a lot more communication directly with ICE. If they encountered someone they thought might be a trafficking victim, they would sort of connect with us. But we have seen a real shift sort of mirroring what's happening nationally, and also that sort of escalation. We've always seen some law enforcement cooperation, but that has really been sort of highlighted during this past year because of the impact. Once people are turned over to ICE, they just disappear into the system. That's very difficult to get them out.
And do we have sort of an estimate of how long before someone is actually found in this machine? Because from just having conversation with folks who are directly being impacted, sometimes it's days before they can find their loved ones.
It can be, it can be weeks. I mean, it really depends. And it depends, even in cases where we've been representing clients, it's sometimes difficult. It depends on which office they're being held on, whether they're being held by Border Patrol or by ICE. There was a situation several months back. There was actually a state legislator who contacted me because somebody had contacted her about an individual who had been detained, who just hadn't come home from work. They were assuming that he was picked up by ICE. They couldn't track him down. Between her, a sheriff, and Congresswoman Pingree office, they were unable to track him down it was over a week until he was in Texas and on his way back to his home country. So it can really vary, but can be up to a couple weeks.
Thank you. Michael, I want to sort of pull us back and focus a little bit on sort of what is happening in Maine in terms of policy standpoint. So turning to the State House, what was the core purpose behind the bill that is now on the governor? And if you want to just talk a little bit of what the bill is about, and what does that look like for Mainers?
Sure. Thank you, Representative Abdi. So I'll pull us back even further than LD 1971, back to 2001. Who was here in 2001? Show of hands. Okay, roughly half the room. You've all heard about 9/11. You all remember when that happened. And then you remember what the federal government's response was to 9/11, which is an almost unprecedented deprivation of civil liberties. In some respects, encoded in federal legislation, in other respects, in the practice of federal law enforcement agencies. And local police were very much a part of that, and Maine was not immune to that. So Beth Stickney, the founder of ILAP, was a lawyer in Maine at the time, and she's an immigration lawyer, just took it upon herself to gather information about the extent of local cooperation in the federal deprivation of civil liberties that the government was carrying out. And she documented dozens of instances in Portland, where ILAP's office first was, and throughout the state, dozens of instances of racial profiling leading to unconstitutional law enforcement actions. And so she and other advocates decided to try and enact a local ordinance in Portland and also get the governor to issue an executive order to restrict police from inquiring into immigration status and from participating in the federal government's civil liberties overreach. And they succeeded. In 2003, Portland passed an ordinance prohibiting all of its public officials, not just its police, from inquiring into immigration status. And Governor Baldacci, in April of 2004, issued an executive order effectively ordering state police to do the same. And that made sure that Maine wasn't taking part in the unconstitutional law enforcement activities of the federal government. In 2011, on January 6th, Paul LePage, as his first act in office, rescinded Governor Baldacci's executive order and replaced it with an executive order directing all state officials, including state law enforcement, to cooperate in federal immigration enforcement to the maximum extent possible. So that's a bit of Maine history that is important to know. To some extent, we've been here before. We don't have to reinvent the wheel entirely. But after Trump was first elected, a rash of states, more than 10 states, enacted their own versions of what Governor Baldacci and what the city of Portland had done in 2004 and 2003. Those states, and I'll just list them so you get a picture of what other states in the country did and what the part of the inspiration for LD 1971 was. And I'll list them in order of the strength of their non-cooperation policies. So Illinois, Oregon, Washington, New Jersey, California, Connecticut, Maryland, Vermont, Colorado, Rhode Island, and New York. So that includes 3 of our New England sister states that each have statewide policies placing a barrier between federal immigration enforcement authorities and their local police. And that's really the goal of LD 1971. LD 1971 started as a very expansive bill to restrict all forms of immigration enforcement and immigration data gathering by state employees and local employees, police and non-police. It ended up being a compromise bill that covers only police behavior and that covers only civil immigration enforcement. So if there's a criminal component that a local police officer, county, municipal, or state police officer is working with federal police with, then immigration enforcement can happen in that context. But in every other context, in situations like what Sue was describing earlier, minor traffic infractions, or someone has a car accident and police are on the scene. In those scenarios, state, local, and county police are restricted from cooperating in immigration enforcement. And I'll just list for you from the bill's section that describes what activities are prohibited if the bill goes into law. A law enforcement agency may not inquire into a person's immigration status, detain a person solely on the basis of a hold request, and I'll describe that after I read the list. Provide to immigration authorities information regarding the person's release date from a jail, unless that information is publicly available. Provide to immigration authorities personal information about the person, including the person's home address or work address. Make or intentionally participate in an arrest based upon a hold request. So what's a hold request? A hold request is one of the strongest tools that federal immigration enforcement authorities have to make states cooperate in their deportation activities. It's essentially a document created by Immigration and Customs Enforcement or Customs and Border Protection, a document that tells jails, we know that the person in your custody is an immigrant. We know that you no longer have a basis to hold them. You can release them because they're done serving their time. Here's a hold request that says, hold them for us until we get there and pick them up. Hold them for how long? Could be months, could be 8 months. Just hold them, and we'll pay you $150 a night for holding that person. And this turns out to be an extremely lucrative proposition for counties, municipalities, and the state. Cumberland County Jail makes $2 million a year from honoring hold requests in this precise scenario. So essentially, rather than let the person go back to their family, back to their community after they've served their time in jail, the jail continues to restrict their freedom pursuant to a civil order generated by ICE, not signed off on by a judge. There are more than 10 states that have actually decided that honoring hold requests is illegal under the state law because their Supreme Courts concluded that you need a state criminal basis to incarcerate someone. You can't incarcerate someone pursuant to a civil document issued by one federal law enforcement agency. And so this bill would require some state basis to continue holding someone that you have in your custody. It would say the person can leave jail on state grounds. You're not allowed to keep holding that person just because ICE told you so, or just because ICE is offering you $150 a night to hold that person. But as I said, this is a compromise bill. One of the things this bill does is give law enforcement basically unlimited freedom in how they carry out joint criminal enforcement task forces. And I'll read that section of the bill to you, just so you realize how expansive it is. So the bill, in a section titled Permitted Activity, says, if an activity does not violate a policy of the law enforcement agency or state or local law or policy of the jurisdiction in which the agency is operating, a law enforcement agency may conduct enforcement or investigative duties associated with a joint law enforcement task force, including the execution of a warrant or sharing of confidential information with a federal law enforcement agency, if the primary purpose of the joint law enforcement task force is not immigration enforcement, the enforcement or investigative duties are primarily related to a violation of state or federal law, including but not limited to terrorism, drug trafficking, or human trafficking. So these three examples are just examples. The list is longer, but they came right out of the mouth of the Auburn Chief of Police, Chief Moen, who during the Judiciary Committee's discussion of this bill was there representing chiefs of police. And this is one of the objections they had to the bill as initially drafted. And the committee changed the bill to reflect their concerns. Unfortunately, they didn't change their posture from opposition to supporting or to being neutral. But the bill did become a compromise bill at the end of that process. And that's what we have. And as Representative Abdi, I think, said earlier, the governor will have 3 days whether to decide to veto this bill starting on January 7th when the legislature reconvenes. If she doesn't veto it, it goes into law 90 days after the legislature adjourns. And this is the final thing I'll say. If she doesn't veto the bill, it goes into effect sometime late next summer or early next fall. That means that between now and then, the status quo continues. And what is the status quo? The status quo is that there really is no Maine law restricting local, county, or state police from participating in immigration enforcement activities. And that's why my wonderful colleague, who's a Lewiston resident, Alicia, and I have been working with the Rockland City Council over the last several months to try to enact essentially a local version of LD 1971. Last Monday, the Rockland City Council voted 4-1 to advance that measure to a final vote. A final vote is scheduled for December 8th, 2 weeks from Monday. And so if any of you are curious about what your towns, what your municipalities can do, I urge you to take inspiration from Rockland.
And was that inspired by residents just taking up upon themselves, reaching out to you, or how did that come about?
It was a group of activists and an extraordinarily courageous city councilor named Caitlin Callahan reached out to us, and we've been working with them since June or July.
Thank you, Michael. So if this bill becomes law, what practical change would your clients experience?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I mean, what we're seeing in Maine is like there's no real centralized tracking place in Maine to identify every time that somebody is turned over by law enforcement to ICE. But we've been tracking in cases where we have some ability to corroborate to some extent. And we have tracked at least 22 incidents where at least 50 people were detained. These include children. These include many people who, most of them did not have criminal records. It included somebody who had stopped to help out in an accident. It included people who were injured in an accident, and then instead of having the medical attention come, they called ICE. It included people who had been present at a drowning incident. So several people who had, encountered. And then there was another situation where there was someone who had come to assist where somebody was being arrested in a traffic incident. A family member came to take the car, had a pending immigration application, and the police noticed that they were speaking Spanish and called immigration. This is sort of an example of how it can impact. This individual who was working, had no criminal record, had a pending application for temporary protected status. It had been pending for more than 2 years, was picked up by ICE after local law enforcement called. They were quickly transferred out of state. We ended up having to represent that individual in immigration court to try to request a bond hearing because ICE, this is the case I was referring to earlier, where the ICE attorneys were trying to argue that they were subject to expedited removal and had absolutely no right to a hearing, even though the immigration records showed documentation that they had been here, an application actually pending for 2 years. And so the immigration judge granted bond. I still tried to refuse to release them. Eventually, we're able to get that individual released, and the person is now back home. They said that they were in jail with many other people. They were from Venezuela, many other Venezuelans there, and they said they were the only one of that whole group who actually got released. And they said it was only because they had a lawyer. And in fact, there was one point they were ready to just sign the waiver that everybody else was signing, and their lawyer happened to call from our office. And they were like, okay, I have hope. And then they ended up being able to be released. And that's just one example of many, many people. This system that people are getting into is just so atrocious and so devoid of human rights or due process. And it starts with somebody being turned over many times, not always. There are ICE arrests and other types of incidents, but we are seeing many where it is law enforcement turning people over to ICE. So if they didn't do that, that just would have stopped that person. That person would have gone home from work that day and had dinner with their family and gone to work the next day.
Thank you. I want to actually pull us back a little bit because I think we're part of this, the we often are involved in this discussion of immigration, and we kind of have a better understanding of what the difference between a refugee and asylum is. Will you just walk us through a little bit so that folks who are in here who may not be familiar of
Sure.
who's actually really being impacted? Who are the people we're talking about when it comes to ICE and when it comes to just this entire issue that is impacting our community the way that it is right now?
Sure. Well, the groups of people being impacted are much larger now, and even include people in legal status. But even beyond refugees and asylees, I mean, I could talk for hours about the different immigration statuses, but can just talk sort of generally. What we have is a category of, citizens, or people who are U.S. citizens, and people who are non-citizens. Citizens could be people who were born here. They could be people who derived citizenship when a parent became a citizen, depending on the time, how old they were at the time. Or somebody who acquired citizenship at birth. We've seen people who were like born in Canada to U.S. citizen parents, and they have to prove that they were acquired citizenship. And then there are people who are non-citizens, and those can be, there are different categories. There are people who are in non-immigrant status, which means, visitor, the alphabet soup of immigration status. Visitors, students, all different types of employment-based visas and others. And then we have people who are in different types of humanitarian status. We have temporary protected status, which is something that can be designated and undesignated by the federal government, which is why we see lots and lots of people who have been here for years and years and years under temporary protected status being denied. Other people in different types of humanitarian status, like domestic violence and trafficking victims and unaccompanied minors who have special paths to legal status. There are other people who can have employment-based options. And then we have refugees and asylees, which is what we see a lot here in Maine. And there's a lot of similarities and differences between those groups. Both groups meet really the same United Nations definition that's been adopted by the United States and codified in our statutes, which is somebody who has a well-founded fear of persecution in their country because of one of 5 protected grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, and social group. And that they are, fear of persecution by the government or someone the government can't control. It can be a very difficult thing to prove. It's not based on what country you're from. It's your own individual circumstances. Refugees are people who have fled their home country and typically have landed in another country, sometimes staying in refugee camps, and it's determined that they cannot be sent back to their home country because of the conditions there. So they are then resettled in different countries that agree to resettle refugees. The United States is one of those countries. And every year the federal government determines how many refugees we're going to resettle. And that's what we've seen a lot in the news, where the Trump administration has decided to shut down the refugee system. And now we're opening it up only for white South Africans. But that's been, and basically people who come as refugees arrive here, they're processed abroad, they're vetted and more than really anyone else. And then they arrive here with valid refugee status that gives them authorization to work immediately and to get certain benefits and supports. And they get processed by or supported by a local refugee resettlement agency. Catholic Charities is one of those agencies here in Maine. And then they have a path towards getting their green card and citizenship. Asylum seekers have to meet that same definition, but they have to get to Maine some other way. They are processed inside the country. You can't go to a U.S. embassy and say, I'd like to apply for asylum. You have to get here either on a visa, like a visitor visa or student visa. Sometimes people are able to get here, or crossing the border and then expressing your desire to apply for asylum. And that's what we have seen. A lot of asylum seekers who have arrived in recent years have arrived in that way, where they've come from Central Africa, have managed to get to Brazil, traveled on a horrific journey through South and Central America, up through Mexico to the southern border, and then moved to different areas of the country, including Maine. And then they have a long process where they need to apply for asylum. If they're in that immigration court process, they have to, if they arrived at the southern border and encountered immigration, they then have to do that in immigration court. If someone comes on a visa, they can apply what's called affirmatively. So they send in an application and then have an interview. We've seen people, because the people who have filed those applications affirmatively through the asylum office is only funded by application fees that people pay for their applications, which is extraordinarily high. And in fact, those have been increased again by the Trump administration in order to prevent people from applying for status. But
Can you just
But-
give us an idea of how much roughly an application? would-
Sure. So now it used to be that there was no fee for asylum, and now you have to pay $100 to apply for asylum, even though you're not eligible to work until your asylum application has been filed and pending for 6 months. And then you have to pay $100 each year that the government is backlogged and unable to process your application. We have clients whose cases have been pending since 2014, because what they did is in 2014, there were so many cases pending, they couldn't handle them. So they said, okay, forget about everyone before, we're going to do last in, first out. And so all those people who were like stopped at that point have been sitting and waiting, and finally are getting processed now. We are getting actually some cases are getting approved. But people are just waiting years and years. And those are the people who are now in a traffic stop with their application, pending for 11 years, getting picked up by ICE. And just because the government hasn't processed their application, they're getting detained. So that's sort of the difference. And then asylees, once they are eventually granted asylum status, can then apply for their green card and citizenship. And green card is like a permanent resident. There's different ways people get permanent residency and then eventually citizenship. But one thing we are seeing now is people, because there's so much racial profiling in these large raids that ICE is doing and the law enforcement turning people over, it's not based on immigration status, it's based on the color of someone's skin and what language they're speaking. And then they might, accidentally get detained and eventually have to fight themselves to get out.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think all of us in this room can agree that Maine considers itself a welcoming state. From a democratic and human perspective, what would it be like for Maine to truly embody that, both legally, culturally, and politically? And I'll add, how can communities push back against the misinformation and fear that drive anti-immigrant rhetoric? Whichever you want to take that on first.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, no, there's a lot. I mean, I think, so immigration law is federal, so there's nothing the state of Maine can do to change the immigration laws. But there are a lot of laws that the state can put into effect. For example, 1971, other types of laws that can impact, that intersect with immigration and that can change immigrants' lives. And that can really have a huge impact, especially right now when you have a whole community or many communities who are just living in this fear, hearing their federal government telling them they don't want them here. So really anything that the state and local communities can do to make people feel more welcomed, which I think a lot of communities are doing a really great job. We've been just so grateful to see the amazing community support in Wells, in like Winthrop and Monmouth, and so many other communities who are pushing back against local, cooperation with ICE, letting people know they want immigrants in their community. And so I think, just supporting local measures that help protect immigrants, and then also being informed about what's happening and making sure you're getting information from accurate places. We have information on our website and links to organizations that are reputable. We do community updates every other week that provide sort of general updates on what's happening. But it's really important to understand what's happening, share that with your neighbors. There's so much misinformation out there. It's why the administration has been able to have this as their central sort of political issue, because people just don't understand what immigration is. They had no idea. And because immigrants have been this attempt to really connect immigrants to criminality where there's really no connection at all. If you look at statistics, immigrants are much less likely actually to commit crimes than US born citizens. And so that misinformation causes people to just sort of agree with whatever the government's doing, and really helping keep yourselves and your neighbors informed is really important.
Michael?
Sure. So as Sue said, Maine can't order federal officials what to do and what not to do. We can only order our own officials, our own state police, our own civilian officials. But one thing every municipality can do and every county can do and the state government can do is cut its ties with organizations like Flock. Flock is a surveillance company that has, I think, predatory marketing tactics. And what they do is they persuade municipalities that they can reduce their police budgets, that they can make policing more efficient, that they can reduce the burden on the taxpayer by installing cameras everywhere, surveillance cameras. And these surveillance cameras are connected to a national network of tens of thousands of cameras. And if you have a Flock contract in Galveston, Texas, you can access information that's gathered in Lewiston, Maine. What that end, ICE, CBP, Border Patrol can also and have also accessed the information that's gathered by these surveillance cameras. And so though we can't tell federal officials what to do and what not to do, we can deprive them of information that some of our municipal officials are unknowingly turning over by signing contracts with companies like Flock. Flock's not the only one, but it's one of the most egregious. And I think Lewiston either has or is considering a contract with Flock. I see my colleague who's working on this issue nodding. This is not something that is widely known. It's not something that a newcomer to Maine is going to necessarily feel welcomed by if they know that there aren't Flock cameras everywhere. But the impact of the ubiquity of these cameras is that Big Brother's watching. Big Brother includes the federal government. And if they're looking for you, they can easily use facial recognition technology to find you in Sanford, Maine, in Auburn, in Holton, in Madawaska, Flock markets everywhere. And the idea is to have a nationwide interconnected network of tens of thousands. I think last I checked, there are about 85,000 Flock cameras throughout the country. To have a nationwide interconnected network that lets one person somewhere know where really anyone is in the country. And we do have the strongest facial surveillance ban in the country. The ACLU worked on that in 2001. I helped write that law. It might be getting violated. We have suspicions that it might be getting violated. But even with the strongest facial surveillance ban in the country, there is quite a bit of leeway to deploy Flock cameras for things like traffic enforcement or criminal investigation. But sometimes the perceived benefits just aren't big enough. And so I would urge you all to talk to your city councilor, to your mayor, sitting right there, I guess, about this issue, and make sure policing is done the old-fashioned way and not through these new technologies that carry unprecedented risks. I don't have much more to add to what Sue said about statewide policies. I suppose there is one thing that I'll mention, which is Representative Delac, who was the lead sponsor of LD 1971, also sponsored a bill to establish an Office of New Americans. And I think part of the mandate of that office, which now exists in the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future, part of the mandate is to be more welcoming, to integrate new people into Maine's social, economic, and cultural life more seamlessly. And I think that's a great thing.
Thank you both. We are heading towards the end of this conversation, but I want to, both of you kind of touched on this a little bit, but if everyone in this room took one concrete action after today to strengthen, again, like due process, democratic protections for immigrant, what should it be? What is it, something that maybe they can talk to their neighbor about, their friends, their families, that they can, it's something small, something big, whatever that comes to either of you guys' mind.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, well, I think with Thanksgiving coming in next week, it's a great opportunity to talk to your relatives who maybe aren't following immigration issues as much as you are, and to, you know, sort of share some of the stories that you've heard. What we find is it's when people have that personal connection with somebody who's been impacted, even people who are like not, you know, supportive of immigrants in the past, and like, oh my gosh, this coworker, I didn't know this was going to impact them, or this is like my kid's friend from school, why is their parent being shipped back to Ecuador? Just sort of having that personal connection can have such an impact. And so just encouraging you to reach out to your neighbors and get to know your immigrant neighbors, and, you know, share their stories and these issues with your friends and your family. I would say also just really, you know, taking inspiration from these communities that have really pushed back. It's made a huge difference, and it's really inspiring to see. So just getting connected to your local communities and finding out what's happening at a citywide level, because I think, you know, there's so much, I mean, this is even a piece of a larger like challenges to our democracy. And I think it really is just like that local level of staying connected, pushing back where we have an impact, and continuing to do that.
I would suggest calling your police chief. I don't know if any of you have. Raise your hand if you've ever called your police chief. I'm curious. One, oh, well, of course you have. Okay, so 3 current or former elected officials. You'll have a new one on Monday. So run for police chief, become the police chief on Monday. No, I'm just kidding. So even if 1971 were to become law, this is my point, were to become law late next year, it has to be followed. It has to be implemented. And the way to do that is one law enforcement officer at a time. And the one who is responsible for your safety cares what you have to say, cares what you think. So I would encourage you to call your police chief and start a conversation about what it means to only enforce state law. Leave federal law to the side, because the people enforcing federal law are engaging in widespread violations of constitutional rights. And then for the proverbial Thanksgiving dinner conversation, if you have people in your family who might disagree with you about this issue, I strongly recommend reminding them that in the 90s, a lot of gun control legislation from the federal government relied very heavily on local police cooperation. And so under President Trump, you might be glad that your local police are enforcing federal immigration law. But what happens when a President Elizabeth Warren or a President AOC tries to take your guns away by using local police? Maybe it's not going to work too well. And so once you start weaving together state and federal law enforcement, your civil liberties sooner or later might be endangered. You can also politely ask the governor not to veto LD 1971. She does have a constituent services person who answers calls. Is also a Lewiston resident, is not in this room though. You can talk to your city council, to your mayor about enacting an ordinance similar to what Rockland enacted. You can make sure Big Brother doesn't spread its surveillance technologies throughout your city, throughout your county. You can run for county. County government, the most overlooked and underestimated government in the United States, in the state of Maine. They have a lot of power. I would suggest knowing their names as a starting point. And the final thing is, when you're having the Thanksgiving conversation, or when you're talking to your police chief or your sheriff or whoever it may be, remembering that normalizing jailing people for the federal government, even though there's no state basis to hold that person, sooner or later will open those jails up to non-immigrants as well. What happens if late next year the federal government refuses to certify election results and insists falsely that the incumbents won the election and have to stay in power, and then there are mass protests, and then the federal government arrests thousands of people in Maine? Jails are in the habit of accepting federal arrestees and holding them for lots of money. This has been a very lucrative proposition for jails and counties. Well, since that process has been going for years and been working out pretty well for sheriffs and counties, there is a way that when the deprivation of civil liberties for one group, for one small group, immigrants, I think there are about 46 million immigrants in the United States, and probably 11 or 12 undocumented people in the United States. But if half the American population, or a third of or a quarter of the American population doesn't like the fact that the democracy is being subverted, then the discussion with jails about refusing to detain people for the federal government, refusing to hold federal arrestees, will become that much easier if you start it now. If you don't start it now, it'll be a lot harder. They'll ask, where were you last year when we were doing this for immigrants? Where were you last year when your property taxes were being lowered because we get $2 million a year from ICE and CBP? So start these conversations sooner rather than later. It's my recommendation.
Thank you both for your work, for your leadership, and even just being here today to have this conversation with us. This portion of this discussion is now over, so I'm going to turn over the back and obviously a question from the audience as well.
Yep, so we'll take some questions here.
Hello, yes, my name is Carl Schleen, the mayor of Lewiston. I really appreciate you three being here and your service to Lewiston and our state. Representative Abdi, you mentioned that Maine is a welcoming state, and I absolutely agree with that. And Lewiston is a welcoming city. From the moment I became mayor, it's been important to support residents and people all over our city. Lewiston is a welcoming city, and we're working hard to create a safe space for everyone. I really appreciate the work that you're doing that benefits our city and our entire state. Thank you so much for being here.
I had a couple other folks raise their hands as well. I'm going to be circulating throughout the room here.
Thanks. Hi, my name's Scott Harriman, and I represent Ward 3 on the Lewiston City Council. You mentioned the Flock AI cameras, and I did want to let people know that so Lewiston PD has been installing some. They've been up for, I believe, about a month and a half now. I found it very difficult to get information from them about them. They still do not have a policy regarding their use, and which I find concerning. I feel like the policy should have come before they were installed and began to be used. But I have, yeah, as I said, I've had I've had a tough time getting information from them, been getting inconsistent information. And so I just want people to know that this is in place right now. And if they have concerns, reach out to your local elected officials, reach out to the new police chief when they are announced, which is happening on Monday, as was mentioned. And yeah, just if you have concerns, let people know about them.
Thank you, Scott.
Anyone with an additional question? All right, up front, I will come to you.
Do you have numbers at all of how many people have been detained by ICE in Maine or in Lewiston or any kind of area? And secondly, looking at, the three of you, you obviously have a certain viewpoint. I would have loved to have had somebody with a different viewpoint here. I find it really frustrating that all these things are happening, and the typical response when you ask is no comment from, our politicians and legal people. Why aren't they here defending these policies? And what is their defense? I think it's indefensible.
Yeah, thank you for your question. In terms of the number of people, I mean, unfortunately, we don't know because of the sort of lack of transparency. We don't know the number of individuals. Cumberland County Jail has a contract with ICE to hold immigrant detainees, I believe up to 85. There were periods of time where there were about 50 or 60. I'm not sure recent numbers. I think it's a little down. It might be more like 40. I'm not sure exactly. We have a project with a refugee and human rights clinic at Maine Law where they go in and do intake and screening of everybody who's detained there. And then we have regular check-ins with them and we take on cases that we're able to. There's also Two Bridges Jail in Wiscasset that's had, I believe that's gone down a little bit. They also are holding a number of, dozens, I think. I'm not sure exactly how many at a time were being held. And those are two places where people are being held for like the entirety of their, I mean, they are transferred sometimes, but they are there for their whole immigration court hearing, which is done usually by WebEx. Then there's a lot of other jails that Border Patrol is holding people temporarily while they're in the process of turning them over to ICE. But we just unfortunately don't have exact numbers, but there have definitely been hundreds for sure.
And so you asked two questions, the numbers and the other side. Before answering them, I want to welcome Professor Hardy, the greatest poet in Maine, just got tenured by Bates College. So I'm very glad that he was able to show up. Read his poetry if you haven't. It's quite remarkable. So the other side, I would encourage you to go listen to the Senate or the House debate on LD 1971. The other side is fully represented. There is no limit on the number of words or the number of minutes that either side could take to explain its perspective. And I don't know why the organizers of the Great Falls Forum invited us and not other people, but that's not for me to answer. And then the question about numbers. So Lisa Paricio, my equivalent at ILAP, and I and others have been gathering news articles and using interviews with lawyers to figure out not the total number of people that ICE and CBP have detained in Maine, but the total number of people that have ended up in federal immigration detention as a result of state law enforcement activity. And the answer to that question is at least 52 since January 20th. Probably more. These are only the verified cases of people who've been turned over by state or local police in Maine. Yeah, wanted to say another thing, but I forgot.
Yeah, one other thing that I should have mentioned earlier when you were asking Representative Abdi about the impact is just the impact on public safety. And we have heard so many stories of people who are just no longer willing to go to the police when something's happening. We had a situation where somebody who was a victim of really horrible trafficking, they were forced to work at gunpoint, and they were actively assisting local law enforcement in a case. And then when all this, started happening, they just stopped wanting to help. We had a woman who was a victim of severe sex trafficking. She was eligible for a trafficking visa. There was a path for her to gain legal status. We went into the hospital to meet with her. She was too afraid in this environment to cooperate and just decided to continue living sort of undercover. A woman whose husband was detained by ICE was so afraid that she ended up deciding to keep her kid home from school for several months, not because he was sick, but because she was just afraid for him to go to school. There is a woman who is a victim of a serious crime, and we are representing her and getting her U visa, which is a lead to legal status. But because her case was still in process, she got a great opportunity for a job promotion, but it would have required a longer commute, and she decided she didn't want to commute. So it's just really impacting not only people's what they are doing in their daily lives, but just that willingness to cooperate with law enforcement is just going to make our communities a lot less safe.
Thank you so much, all three of you. I have two questions. One of them I should probably know the answer to, but humor me. So temporary protected status. So I know that it kind of comes and goes with the whims of who's the president, right? So they can say, if you're from Haiti, you have temporary protected status, which means when you get here, you're legally here, but then somebody else can say, never mind, I withdraw that, right? So then is that person who has TPS suddenly not legally here, even though when they entered, they were legally able to do that? So that's one question. The other question is about what you know about the effectiveness of having people like me, white citizens, accompany people to their hearings and things like that, and whether that is a practice that is important to support. So thank you. Those are my two questions.
Sure, thanks for those questions. Yeah, temporary protected status is complicated. So basically the way temporary protected status works is it is something for when there's a natural disaster or a civil war or some dangerous event occurring in another country, the federal government can designate that country for temporary protected status. So it's not people can never enter the country to get temporary protected status. You actually had to be here at the time it was designated. So for example, back in 2004 or 5, I can't remember the year that the earthquake in Haiti, the government announced, okay, we're gonna have temporary protected status for Haiti. So anybody who was in the country as of the date that they announced temporary protected status who meet certain requirements. You can't have serious criminal convictions. You have to show that you're continuously in the US. So when you apply, you have to show your continued residence. And then you have to basically, and usually is every 18 months that they are reconsiderate for continuing the TPS designation. And there are several, and it is a little bit sort of random of whether the government, there's lots of horrible things that happen and they don't grant temporary protected status. It's political many times. And then every 18 months they decide, are we going to redesignate this or not? Is it safe for people to go back? Is the country able to receive all these people who have had temporary protected status? Sometimes they will redesignate temporary protected status. They had TPS for Somalia starting in 2001, and they redesignated it several times because and something new had happened, or things were just so horrible that the government decided people who, still should not have to go back. So, so that's how it happens. But then, when it does come up to that expiration, they can terminate it so that everybody loses temporary protected status from that country. What the Trump administration has been doing that has not been done by other countries is trying to terminate it right in the middle. So Biden had redesignated Venezuelan and Haitian TPS, and the Trump administration attempted to just cut it off in the middle. There have been lawsuits. It's gone back and forth and back and forth. And unfortunately, we are seeing people now losing their temporary protected status. An individual could lose TPS if they became ineligible somehow, if they left the country, if they committed a certain crime or something. But otherwise, it's not just random that a person could be given and taken. But it does feel random because it's completely dependent upon the government, like continuing their TPS status. Some are have continued on for really long time periods. Honduran TPS has been here since 1998. That's before I was even practicing immigration law. So you have generations of people who have been here working and have grandchildren here, and now, facing potential losing their status. And then, the second question was about accompanying people. And I think, I think it depends on the circumstances of whether it actually has an impact and ICE does something different than they would. I think it helps the individuals to feel just that they are at least have somebody with them. So I think that sort of safety feeling is good, but we have seen, ICE coming to the courts, ICE coming to lots of different places. So I think it is helpful, but it doesn't guarantee. I mean, we've all seen the horrible videos of people trying to help and getting thrown on the ground and that sort of thing.
All right. And with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. Please, one more round of applause for our panel.